Hello and welcome back to the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. In the final two rounds of the Berlin 1890 tournament, Lasker was slated to play Johann Minkwitz and Max Harmonist. Minkwitz, as we established earlier, effectively dropped out of the tournament, while Harmonist was apparently a victim of the ongoing conflict between Emanuel Lasker, Kurt von Bartheleben, and the arbitration committee. As the story goes, the discussion over the details of the game were apparently taking place in the playing hall, and they got so heated that, in time trouble, Max Harmonist blundered his queen in a supposedly winning position against Hermann von Gottschall. Following this, he joined Kurt von Bartheleben in withdrawing from the tournament, so Emanuel didn't get to play his last two rounds. What's very funny is that Berthold had the same two opponents in the final two rounds, and so with 2 rounds to go, the players could not be caught and they officially tied for first. So, seeing as they had a bunch of extra time, as they didn't actually have to play the final 2 rounds, the two were permitted to play a single playoff game to determine who would win the first and who would win the second prize. We'll be looking at that today. Once again, with the white pieces, Berthold opened with knight to f3. Emanuel responded d5, d4, knight to f6, c4, and he stuck with his Slav setup with c6. Now, recalling their game from round number 4, you'll remember that Berthold lost after incorrectly taking a knight that had landed on e4. This time he decides to alleviate the central tension right away and played c captures on d5. Apparently, this was a theoretical novelty at the time. I have not found an earlier game where the exchange variation was played. Emanuel recaptured, and after knight to c3, most common, according to the database, is for black to commit to the 4-knight setup with knight to c6. Emanuel instead decided to defend his d-pawn with e6. After bishop to g5, bishop to e7, e3, and castles, bishop to d3, only now did he play knight to c6. Here Berthold played the move rook to c1, which is completely reasonable in itself, but what I'd like to focus on is the commentary from the German chess magazine. They claimed that this move enabled white to, in response to knight to b4, respond with bishop to b1. However, I think this is completely reasonable anyway. Like, if white just castles here, on knight to b4, bishop back to b1 is completely reasonable. The problem that black faces is that they don't necessarily have a good way to develop the bishop. If they play something like bishop to d7, then white's just going to kick with a3 and nothing really happens. If b6, then potentially possible for white is even to play knight to e5. This knight is going to be very difficult to kick out of the center. White is going to continue expanding with something like f4, and this initiative could be somewhat annoying. So it's possible that best for black might just be to retreat back knight to c6 and defend the e5 square. White is going to play a3 anyways, ensure that there's no repetition after bishop to d3. And now if something like b6, white has a couple of options. They can again play the bishop back to d3. They can expand on the queen side with b4 and so on. Either way, I don't think that white has any problems to speak of in this position. But as I said, Berthold's move of rook to c1 is completely fine, and after Emanuel played bishop to d7, he ended up castling, so all is well. Emanuel kicked the bishop with h6, and it moved down to h4. After a6, Berthold put his bishop on b1 anyway, and Emanuel continued expanding on the queen side with b5. Now, this position is so modern that all of the database games on chessgames.com are from the 2000s. Bishop captures on f6 was played in a 2007 game. Knight to e5 was played in 2015 by none other than Grandmaster Daniel Dubov, and queen to d3 was played as late as 2024. However, Berthold's move of rook to e1 is a novelty, so it is as of move 13 that the players are playing a unique game. Only after Emanuel's move of g6 did Berthold follow Dubov's example and play knight to e5. And now once again I want to talk about the German chess magazine. They seemed to think that black is allowed to trade on e5 and play knight captures e5, d captures e5, retreat the knight back to e8. And they believe that bishop captures e7, queen captures e7 is a position that is without danger for black. I am of the opinion that white's attack starts to look kind of scary after queen to d2. They're threatening to break in the center with e4, take here on h6, and I think that white actually has a very annoying initiative here. Emanuel did not trade on e5, he instead played rook to c8, and after Berthold expanded with f4, he removed Berthold's ability to win the bishop pair with bishop back to e8. Following queen to f3, he got his king into the defense with king to g7, and after knight to e2, Emanuel even went as far as to play knight back to g8. What would an Emanuel Lasker game be if we didn't have these weird undeveloping of the pieces? We have 3 moves left to make the time control, so let's make them. Bishop captures e7, knight g captures e7, knight to d3, b4, knight to c5, and queen to b6 allows us to reach the first time control. Now this is one of those weird Emanuel Lasker games where his pieces are all shuffling around the back couple of ranks, and their lack of commitment makes it very difficult to predict what concrete plan he's going to adopt, if any. The overall consensus of this position is that it does slightly favor white, if nothing else because of a strong minor piece, but the concrete reasons for why he's better are slightly harder to show. It turns out that the absolute best way for white to play is to go on a kingside attack with g4. And after, for example, Emanuel's move in the game, knight to b8, you make contact with f5. This bishop on b1 is doing an excellent job as an attacker, and for want of time, I'm not going to go through all of the lines, but as per usual, I will leave a clean copy of the PGN down in the description. I encourage you to take a look for yourself. Berthold played things a little bit slower with bishop to d3. His plan is to maintain this strong knight on c5. However, this allows Emanuel to start trading pieces. After knight back to b8, Berthold played this very precise move rook to c2, the payoff of which we'll talk about in just a second. Emanuel played bishop to b5, more or less forcing the trade of bishops. Bishop captures b5, queen captures b5, and now that the c1 square is vacated, Berthold can play knight back to c1. The point being that after knight to d7, knight to d3 defends the knight, and on knight captures c5, Berthold responds with knight captures c5. So he maintains his strong minor piece on c5, and for those reasons, positionally, only he can be better. Emanuel's defense, as is always the case, remains very tenacious. He started with rook to c6, preparing to double on the c-file and also guarding the a6 pawn, freeing the queen from doing so. Now, as far as plans for white are concerned, the German chess magazine once again looked at the move g4, and it works in this position as well. If we go on one of these classic Lasker knight remaneuvers with something like knight to g8, after rook to g2 and knight to f6, there's a good chance that white has some sort of attack with h4. This would certainly be worth investigating. Instead of going on the offensive, Berthold once again kept things under control and played the move king to f2, hinting that he wants an endgame. After Emanuel's knight to f5 and both players doubling on the c-file with rook e to c1 and rook f to c8, Berthold offered a trade of queens with queen to e2. Now, at the time, this was seen as an implicit draw offer, but it's actually somewhat reasonable as Berthold wants to trade queens and get his king centralized for the endgame. Emanuel accepted, queen captures on e2, king captures on e2, and he retreated his knight back to e7. And after king to d3, with Berthold's king being in the center, Emanuel has to make something happen on the king side, so he thrust with g5. Now on f captures g5, h captures on g5, we've reached a position that is perhaps not a classic pause the video moment, but I at least want you to ponder what you would do if you were trying to push for a win here as white. The engine wants to play the move knight to d7, which I think is a reasonable try. It keeps some material on the board, and this e5 outpost is in quite a lot of cases at least as strong as the one on c5. Even if the rooks disappear, I imagine that white has a little bit of pull here. Berthold did not go for that. He instead chopped wood immediately with knight captures on a6. And this, I would say, is the draw offer, because after the exchange, there isn't even a chance that he has an advantage. Emanuel correctly exchanged. Rook captures on a6, rook captures c8, knight captures c8, rook captures c8, and rook captures on a2. Now, in theory, if anybody is better in this endgame, it's actually black, given the free path that his king has to access the center of the board. But I will admit that neither player pushes this quite as accurately as they potentially could have. I think they had both resigned themselves to the draw at this point. We're going to go through the last moves pretty quickly. King to c2, rook to a1, king to b3, rook to e1, rook to c2, rook captures e3 check, king captures b4, and now rook to d3. The players have to make their 40th move. Berthold uses his defending the pawn with king to c5, and Emanuel goes after the other pawn with rook to b3. But after rook to f2, f5, king to d6, king to f6, Berthold made one last shot with rook to e2, and Emanuel very accurately played king to f7. Yes, Berthold is allowed to take on e6, at which point the defender of d5 will be gone, but Emanuel is going to take here on b2. These pawns over here on the king side are going to fall. All of the pawns are eventually going to disappear, and we're going to be left with a completely barren position. So the players didn't bother playing that out, but instead decided that here, move 43 was the time to split the point, and with that, the brothers Lasker were officially declared co-champions of the first ever German Chess Master Association tournament. So there we go, a very mature and professional game to end the Berlin 1890 tournament. I would say that even though Berthold was the only one that ever had an objective advantage around here at move 20-ish, had he played the move g4 and gone on some sort of kingside attack, then maybe we would have had a more exciting game. But there's an argument to be made that the moral victory, or perhaps the psychological victory, went to Emanuel, because he forced Berthold to play rather timidly after their first game, and he wasn't able to take advantage of any opportunities he had as white. Regardless, things were very balanced, and I don't believe that the brothers had any qualms about splitting the first prize in such a prestigious tournament. And that, as they say, is that. With the next video, we'll be moving on to a new tournament, which means new faces and much more chess. There's much more to look forward to, so I look forward to seeing you there. Until then.